My son-in-law never looked at me twice. To him, I was just a slow old man with paint on my boots and a truck that coughed smoke going up hills. He called me the farmer behind my back. His friends laughed. His parents smiled politely when I showed up to Sunday dinners and never asked me a single question. That was fine. I let them have that picture of me. I had built a different one quietly over 40 years, and nobody at that table had ever thought to look. Then one evening, my son-in-law Victor slid a thick white envelope across the kitchen table and told me to sign. He said it was just some routine paperwork. For minutes later, he had no company left to run. Let me tell you who I am first. My name is Gerald Beaumont. I am 69 years old. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer before I retired. I live in a small yellow house on a gravel road outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with a garden my late wife Irene planted and a dog named Pepper who sleeps under the kitchen table. Irene passed 4 years ago. She was the kind of woman who kept every receipt in a shoebox and every promise she ever made. She taught me that real wealth does not need an audience. We raised our daughter Clara in that yellow house, and we were happy there. We were still happy there, just one fewer of us now. Victor Marchetti married Clara 7 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than my first house. He arrived in her life driving a silver car and wearing shirts that had no wrinkles. He was handsome and quick with a joke, and Clara loved him, and so I gave him my hand and my respect. But Victor had a way of looking at things and deciding immediately what they were worth. He looked at my yellow house and saw a problem. He looked at my truck and shook his head. He looked at me and saw someone who would smile, say yes, and not ask questions. He was wrong on all 3 counts, but I let him keep believing it. The company in question was Marchetti Industrial Supply. Victor's father, Donato Marchetti, had built it from nothing in 1986. He started with 1 warehouse, 3 employees, and a handshake reputation for delivering exactly what he promised on time and without excuses. Over the years, Donato grew it into one of the largest industrial supply distributors in the Gulf South region. By the time Victor was old enough to shave, Marchetti Industrial was supplying equipment to refineries, ports, and manufacturing plants across 5 states. Donato was proud of every brick of it. He had earned every single one. In 2001, Donato ran into serious trouble. A contract dispute with a large refinery client had frozen a major receivable, and 2 of his biggest warehouse leases came due at the same time. He needed capital fast, and he needed someone who would not come in and start moving the furniture. He needed a quiet partner. My engineering firm had done substantial work for Marchetti Industrial over the years. Donato trusted me. He came to me not as a businessman, but as a man who was scared and did not want his life's work to disappear. We sat at this very kitchen table. He told me the truth, and I respected him for that. Irene and I had saved carefully our entire lives. We had no debt, no expensive habits, and a significant amount put away that we had never touched because we had never needed to. We put $310 million into Marchetti Industrial for a 53% controlling stake. We asked for nothing visible. Donato kept his name on the building, his title, his authority, and his pride. Our agreement was handled by my attorney Bernard Cole, and it was kept between Donato, Bernard, and the 2 of us. We called our holding entity GB Capital after our initials. No one ever looked twice at it. Over the next 22 years, Marchetti Industrial grew steadily. Donato was a brilliant operator. He expanded into offshore supply, environmental equipment, and energy infrastructure. The Gulf region kept building, and Marchetti Industrial kept winning contracts. That original $310 million stake had grown, through dividends reinvested and value compounded, to just over $5 billion. When Donato stepped back 4 years ago, Victor stepped in as chief executive. Donato had kept our arrangement quiet all those years. Victor inherited a company he thought he fully understood. He did not. It started on a Wednesday morning in October. Victor called me out of nowhere. He never called me. He said he wanted to take me to lunch, said it had been too long, said Clara would be happy knowing we had spent some time together. That should have been enough of a signal right there. I said fine, picked a diner I liked, and drove over in my truck. Victor showed up in the silver car and looked at the diner like it had done something to offend him, but he sat down and ordered coffee and smiled the whole time. He asked how the garden was doing. He asked about Pepper. He was warm and easy, and he never got to the point. I found out the point 3 days later from a different direction entirely. My neighbor Franklin, who had worked in city planning for 20 years before retiring, called me on a Thursday evening and said he had heard something at the parish council meeting that I might want to know about. A development group had submitted a permit application for a large distribution and logistics hub on the Eastern Road Corridor. The proposed access route for the entire development ran through the back corner of my property, a 2-acre strip of land behind my garden that Irene had always called the Quiet Corner. Franklin read me the project name. It was a Marchetti Industrial subsidiary. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call. Pepper put his head in my lap. I drank a glass of water slowly. Then I called Bernard. Bernard Cole had been my attorney for 26 years. He was 71, calm in every situation, and sharp in a way that got quieter and more dangerous the older he got. I told him everything Franklin had told me. I told him about Victor's lunch invitation and how friendly he had been. I told him I expected a formal offer on the property before the end of the month. Bernard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Shall I prepare the clause?" Our shareholder agreement with Marchetti Industrial contained a conduct provision, Clause 22, which stated that any officer of the company who used company resources, assets, or corporate relationships to personally benefit from or bring pressure against a controlling shareholder would be subject to immediate removal subject to board vote. It was a clause Bernard had insisted on all those years ago, and Donato had agreed to without argument because he understood why it existed. I told Bernard to get everything ready. Termination filing, asset review, emergency board notice. I wanted it all prepared and sitting on his desk before the weekend. He said he would call me Friday morning. I spent that Thursday the way I usually spend it. I watered the garden in the morning and pulled weeds along the tomato row. I made a plate of eggs and ate at the table by the window. In the afternoon, I went through some old boxes in the back room where Irene had kept the early files from the engineering firm before we had real office space, when we worked off the dining table and took calls on a phone with a cord. There's a photo in one of those boxes from our first big contract, a bridge support job in 1979. Irene is standing next to the survey stake with mud on her boots, laughing. I look at that photo, and I can still hear exactly what she sounded like. Bernard called Friday morning as promised. He said everything was prepared. He also told me he had quietly reached out to 2 long-standing board members at Marchetti Industrial, people who had known Donato for decades and who had, in Bernard's words, concerns about the direction of the past 4 years under Victor's leadership. One of them was a woman named Patricia Odom, who had been on the board 11 years and had more spine than most people in any room she entered. The other was a man named Raymond Castile, who had been Donato's first outside investor and had watched Victor's tenure with growing unease. Both were ready to act when the time came. The envelope arrived the following Tuesday. Victor drove it over himself in the silver car. He knocked on my door just after noon. He was wearing a jacket and carrying a leather folder, and he smiled like he was doing me a favor. He sat at the kitchen table and pulled out a single white envelope and slid it across to me. He explained that Marchetti Industrial was planning a significant infrastructure expansion in the Eastern Corridor and that the project required a small adjustment to the access configuration. He said the company wanted to compensate me fairly. He said it would be a simple signature and that Clara would be glad to know her father had been taken care of. He used those words, taken care of. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Victor. He had the same easy smile he always carried, the one that said everything was already decided and I was just the last step in an administrative process. Pepper was sitting by the back door watching him. I picked up the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was an offer letter on Marchetti Industrial letterhead. The offer for the 2-acre strip was $87,000. 2 acres of land that sat directly in the path of a project whose permit filings, which Franklin had forwarded to me, indicated an expected development value of over $400 million. I set the envelope down flat on the table. I did not sign it. I did not raise my voice. I asked Victor if he wanted a glass of water. He said no. I asked if he would like coffee. He said no thank you, and his smile went slightly stiff at the edges. I said I would need some time to think about it. He said, of course, no rush, take the week, but that the permit timeline was firm and they really did need a resolution soon. He said again that Clara would be glad to see this settled. That was the second time he mentioned Clara, and I noted it. He stood up, thanked me for my time, and walked back to the silver car. I watched him leave, and then I called Bernard. I told Bernard about the $87,000 offer. Bernard made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he told me what he had confirmed that morning through a contact at the parish permit office. The Marchetti Industrial Subsidiary had already filed a conditional approval request. The filing listed the property access as pending private acquisition. In other words, Victor had told the permit office the land was as good as his before he had knocked on my door. He had not offered. He had reported. I asked Bernard if Clara had any knowledge of this. He said as far as he could tell, she did not. That mattered to me. Over the following days, I kept my routine. I walked the property in the mornings. I talked to Franklin over the fence. I had coffee at the diner on Thursday, the way I always did. I did not call Victor. I did not call Donato. I did not mention anything to Clara. She called me Wednesday evening to check in the way she always did, and we talked for 20 minutes about her job and the weather and whether Pepper had been eating well. She sounded happy, and I was glad she sounded happy, and I did not say a word about any of it. I let the week pass. Then I called Victor and told him I was ready to talk and invited him to dinner Saturday night. He said wonderful. He said he would bring his parents. That surprised me slightly, but I said fine. I expected Donato. What I did not fully anticipate was that Donato would walk in looking like a man who had spent several nights convincing himself that what was happening was acceptable. He sat down at my table, and he could not look me in the eye for the first 20 minutes. Victor's mother, Elena, had brought a dessert, which she set on the counter with a kind smile. And I liked Elena, had always liked her, and I felt sorry she was in the room for what was about to happen. Clara sat beside me. She did not know what was coming. I had cooked a real dinner. Chicken, rice, green beans from the garden. I had set the table properly with the good plates Irene had picked out years ago. We ate and we talked, and Victor was charming and relaxed, and Donato was quiet, and Elena asked about the garden, and Clara helped me clear the first plates. It was a normal dinner. It looked like a normal dinner. Victor waited until dessert was on the table before he said anything. He said he was glad we were all together. He said family was important. He said he hoped we could close out the property matter tonight in a way that worked for everyone. Then he slid a new envelope across the table toward me. This one was thicker than the first. Victor said the company had increased its offer significantly out of respect for the family relationship and my years of loyalty. He said the new number was inside. He said all I had to do was open it, look at it, and say yes, and everyone could enjoy their dessert and go home happy. He said it with the warmth of a man closing a deal he had already won. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Donato. Donato was staring at the tablecloth. Elena was holding her fork above her slice of cake and not eating. Clara was looking at me with a small question in her eyes. I picked up the envelope. I set it back down unopened. I said I had something I wanted to share before we talked about the property. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out my phone. I had called Bernard that afternoon from the back porch, and he had walked me through exactly what I needed to do. I opened the document he had sent me, a single file with GB capital letterhead at the top. I set the phone on the table and turned the screen toward Victor. He leaned forward and read it. It took him about 8 seconds. Then the warmth went out of his face entirely. Donato looked up from the tablecloth. Elena lowered her fork completely. Clara went very still. On the screen was a summary shareholder document from Marchetti Industrial Supply. It listed the ownership structure. Victor Marchetti held 4% directly. The Marchetti Family Trust held 32%. Various institutional holders accounted for the balance. At the top of the list, in the majority position, was GB Capital LLC with 53.4% controlling interest. Below that, in Bernard's clean, precise handwriting, was a single line that read, GB Capital is the sole trading name of Gerald and Irene Beaumont, registered 2001. I looked at Victor. I said quietly, I have owned this company for 22 years. Victor sat back in his chair slowly. It was the first time I had ever seen him look genuinely unsure of what to do next. He opened his mouth and closed it. Donato let out a long breath and put both hands flat on the table. Elena set her fork down on her plate with a small sound. Clara looked at me, and then at Victor, and then back at me. I could see her working through it, all of it, the timeline and the lunch invitation and the envelope and the dinner. Her face moved through several things quickly and then went quiet. Victor found his voice first. He said there must be some kind of mistake. I said there was no mistake. I said Donato could confirm every word if he chose to. Donato said nothing. His silence was the confirmation. Victor said this was not legal, that a sleeping shareholder at this level had obligations, disclosures, that he would have his lawyers review this tonight. I told him he was welcome to do that. I said Bernard Cole had anticipated that response and had prepared a full legal opinion on the validity of the arrangement, the governance rights it carried, and specifically the conduct provisions it contained. Then I picked up my phone again and dialed Bernard directly and put him on speaker. Bernard answered on the second ring. His voice was steady and clear across the kitchen table. He said good evening and confirmed that he was representing GB Capital in all matters. He said he was calling to notify all present parties that GB Capital was invoking Clause 22 of the founding shareholder agreement due to documented misuse of company resources and corporate position for the purpose of coercing a controlling shareholder into a below-market property transaction. He said the documentation had been filed. He said the board notification had been sent. He said an emergency meeting had been called for Monday morning at 9. Victor stood up. He said this was outrageous. He said the property negotiation was a legitimate business matter. He said he had done nothing wrong. Bernard said the permit filings told a different story. He said the subsidiary had used Marchetti Industrial Infrastructure, staff time, and corporate relationships in its pursuit of the acquisition, and that the conditional permit application had listed the property as acquired before any agreement was reached, which constituted a misrepresentation to the parish permit office. He said all of this was documented, time-stamped, and in the board materials that had been delivered to Patricia Odom and Raymond Castile by secure courier that afternoon. Donato spoke for the first time in several minutes. He said Gerald, just my name. I looked at him. He looked older than I had ever seen him look. He said he did not know about the permit filing or the conditional approval. He said Victor had told him the acquisition was being handled properly. He said he was sorry. I believed him. Donato Marchetti had been many things over the years, but he had never been a liar to my face. And the way he said sorry was the way a man says it when he means it and has no excuse to offer. I told him I knew that. I told him that was why the board action was directed at Victor and not at him. Victor was pacing now along the side of the kitchen. He said he had built that company for 4 years. He said he had grown revenue by 30%. He said this was a family disagreement being weaponized as a corporate action. I said I disagreed with all 3 of those characterizations, but that he was welcome to make them to the board on Monday if he chose to appear. I said Clause 22 was clear and the documentation was complete, and that Patricia Odom had already called Bernard that afternoon to say she had reviewed the materials and was prepared to vote. Victor said Patricia had no authority to act unilaterally. Bernard, still on speaker, said she had plenty of authority as a board member and she was not acting alone. I want you to understand something about how I felt in that moment. I was not enjoying it. I have never been a man who enjoyed the falling part, the moment when something breaks and other people have to watch it break. Donato had been my friend for over 2 decades. Elena was a kind woman who had brought dessert to my house. Clara was my daughter, and she was sitting at my kitchen table watching her husband come undone, and I could see on her face that she was doing the hard math, the kind you do when you realize that the person you love has done something that changes how you have to see them. That math is painful. I know because I was doing my own version of it. I said to the room that I want to be clear about one thing. I had not come to this table tonight to destroy anyone. I had come because Victor had come to my house twice with envelopes and used my daughter's name as a closing argument. And I was not going to sign a piece of paper that traded Irene's land for $87,000 or any other number because that land was not for sale and had never been for sale. And the only reason it was being pursued was because Victor had assumed I was too old and too simple and too grateful for the attention to say no. He had assumed wrong. I told Bernard that I was satisfied with where things stood tonight and that I would speak with him Sunday, before the Monday meeting. Bernard said everything was in order. He said goodnight to the room, and I ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. Victor had stopped pacing. He was standing with one hand on the back of his chair the way you stand when you're not sure whether to sit back down or leave. Donato had not moved. Elena was looking at the table. Clara was looking at me. I pushed back my own chair and stood up slowly. I was not in a hurry. There was nothing left to rush. I walked to the counter and picked up the envelope Victor had slid across the table. I walked to the back door and opened it and set it outside on the step. I said I would not be needing that. I said the property was not part of any transaction, tonight or in the future, and that any further approach on the matter would be treated as continued conduct in violation of Clause 22. I said the development project was welcome to redesign its access route, which the permit office would need to hear about by Friday, given the conditional filing, and that Bernard had already drafted a letter to the parish office correcting the record on the ownership status. Victor said quietly that I had no idea what I was doing to this family. I said I had a very precise idea of what I was doing and that he had started it when he drove to my house the first time with a leather folder and a number that insulted both of us. I said the conduct provision existed for exactly this reason. I said that if he had come to me honestly as my daughter's husband and as the son of my longtime partner and said we have a real problem with this access route, can we talk about it? I would have listened. I might even have helped. But he had not done that. He had assumed, and then he had maneuvered, and now we were here. Donato stood up slowly. He put his hand on the back of Elena's chair, and he looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Gerald, I am sorry for what my son did." He said it with a directness that cost him something. You could hear it in his voice. I said I knew he was. I said our partnership had been a good one for 22 years, and I had no intention of ending it. I said what was ending was Victor's role as chief executive, and that was a governance matter, not a personal one, and that the company would be in good hands with interim leadership while the board determined next steps. Donato nodded once and put his hand briefly on my shoulder and walked with Elena to the front door. They left quietly. The front door closed, and then it was just Victor and Clara and me in the kitchen. Clara had not spoken since before Bernard's call. She was sitting with both hands around her water glass and her eyes on the middle of the table. Victor looked at her and then at me. He said Clara understood that this was not personal, that it was business. Clara set her water glass down. She said she understood that he had driven to her father's house twice and used her name to try to pressure a sick old man. Those were her words, in assigning over land that her mother had loved. Victor started to say something, and Clara said she was not finished. She said she did not know her father owned the company. She said she had never known, and he had never told her, and that was his right. She said what she did know was what she had just watched happen at this table, and that she needed some time to think. Victor said Clara, and she said she needed him to go home now, and that she would call him tomorrow. The way she said it was the voice of a woman who had made a decision and was being very careful and very controlled about it. Victor looked at her for a moment and then picked up his jacket and left. Clara and I sat in the kitchen for a while after he left. I made tea. She sat with her hands around the mug the way Irene used to sit. She asked me how long I had known about the property plan. I told her about Franklin's call and about the permit filing. She asked if I had thought about just selling. I said no. She asked why not. I told her about the afternoon Irene and I first walked that piece of ground. We had not been planning to buy anything that day. We were just walking. Irene stopped at the back corner where the old oak tree stands, the one with the split trunk, and she sat down in the grass and said, "This is where I want to be when I need to be quiet." Clara set down her tea and looked at the window. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she remembered that tree. She said Irene used to take her there when she was small, said they would bring a blanket and a book, and sometimes they would not even read. They would just sit and listen to whatever was happening in the field. I said yes. I said the day someone puts a loading dock on that ground is not a day I can allow to happen as long as I have anything to say about it. Clara said she understood. Then she said she was sorry she had not spoken sooner at the table. I told her that fear is something you work through, not something you simply don't feel. She drove home around 10. I washed the dishes and put away the good plates and sat with Pepper for a while on the back step. The night was cool and clear, and I could see the field behind the garden in the dark, the shape of the oak tree visible against the sky. I sat there a long time. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in the way you feel after something that was necessary, but not easy. I thought about Irene. I thought about what she would have said if she had been at that table tonight. I think she would have said very little. She was better than I am at knowing when silence does the heavier lifting. The board meeting on Monday morning was efficient. Bernard and I arrived at Marchetti Industrial Headquarters at 8:45. The lobby was the same lobby I had walked through a dozen times over the years to meet Donato, but it felt different coming in as the majority shareholder, making it known for the first time. Patricia Odom was already in the boardroom with Raymond Castile and 4 other board members. Patricia was a compact woman with silver hair, the kind of stillness that meant she had already made up her mind and was simply waiting for the process to catch up. She stood when I walked in. The others did as well. Victor arrived at 9 with a lawyer I had not met before. He looked like he had slept a few hours, not enough. He sat at his end of the table, and his lawyer opened a folder. Bernard presented the case in precise order. The permit filing showing the property listed as acquired before consent was obtained. The email chain from the Marchetti subsidiary project manager to Victor requesting approval to pursue all available means of acquisition. Victor's written reply authorizing the approach. The 2 visits to my home documented with the offer amounts. The use of Clara's name as leverage, noted in my own written account which Bernard had prepared for my dictation Friday afternoon. Victor's lawyer made 2 objections during the presentation. Bernard addressed both calmly and completely. When Bernard finished, Patricia Odom looked down the table at Victor and asked if he wished to respond before the vote. Victor's lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly. Victor looked at the table. He said the property negotiation had been a legitimate business matter handled within normal parameters. Patricia said the conditional permit filing predating any consent was not within normal parameters, and he knew that. Victor said nothing more. Patricia moved for immediate termination. Raymond seconded. The vote was 7-0. Victor's lawyer wrote something in his folder. Victor sat for a moment after the vote. He looked down the table at me. He said he had taken that company from $60 million in revenue to over $90 million in 4 years. He said that was real, and it deserved real acknowledgement. I said the growth was real, and I acknowledged it. I said a capable operator who misuses his position is still someone who has misused his position, and those 2 things do not cancel each other out. He had no answer for that. Security came and walked him to the elevator. The doors closed. Patricia Odom was named interim chief executive by unanimous vote 14 minutes later. Her first act in that role was to withdraw the conditional permit filing with the parish office and direct the project engineering team to develop a revised access route that did not require the Beaumont property. 3 months later, the engineers came back with a northern corridor option that added about 400 meters to the access road and cost the project roughly $600,000 more to build. The project went forward. The development broke ground the following spring. The 2-acre strip behind my garden remained exactly as it was. The oak tree with the split trunk is still there. I walk out to it sometimes in the mornings. The parish issued a notice in February that they were establishing a small nature conservation easement along the eastern boundary of the Beaumont property in recognition of the land's contribution to the local watershed. The easement was named in honor of Irene Beaumont, who had advocated for rural land preservation in the area for years before her passing. I found out by letter. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee, and then I read it again. Then I went outside and stood in the garden for a while without doing anything in particular. It seemed right. It seemed like exactly the kind of thing she would have been quietly pleased about and never once bragged about. Clara came to see me on a Saturday in March. She arrived without calling ahead. She was wearing jeans and old sneakers, and her hair was loose. She looked like she had been sleeping better than she had in some time. She said she had filed for divorce. She said it was her decision, made alone, and that she was clear it was right. She said she was not asking for anything and was not there to talk about money or logistics. She was there because she wanted to sit with me and because she had been thinking about her mother and about the house and about the things she had not paid close enough attention to for too long. We sat on the back porch most of the morning. Pepper was asleep in the sun. Clara asked me to tell her things about Irene, stories from before Clara was born, from the early years. I told her about how Irene used to read engineering manuals to understand what I was doing at work. I told her about the first house they almost bought before this one, a bigger place, nicer neighborhood, and Irene had walked through it twice and said it did not feel like them. I told her about the morning the yellow paint went on the front wall, and Irene stood back on the gravel and said that's the one. Clara laughed. She said she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. I said that was about right. She did not ask me about money. She did not ask about the company or the shareholder arrangement or what any of it meant for her. She drank her coffee and watched the field, and at one point she got up and walked out to the oak tree and stood there for a while on her own. I watched from the porch. She had her hands in her pockets and her head slightly down, and she stayed there maybe 5 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and said her mother really knew how to pick a spot. I said she really did. We stayed outside until it got cold in the early afternoon, and then we went in, and I made soup from the garden. There are men who spend their whole lives making sure people know what they have. They drive the car that announces it, and wear the watch that proves it, and drop the number into every room they enter. Irene and I were never those people. We built things. We saved carefully. We kept our word, and we kept our business to ourselves, and we never needed anyone to validate the life we had made. That discipline protected us from 100 small problems over the years, and it protected us from a very large one on a Saturday evening in November when a young man with a leather folder sat at our kitchen table and assumed he already knew the answer. He assumed I was too old to fight back. He assumed I did not understand what the land was worth. He assumed that because I drove a truck that smoked and lived in a small yellow house on a gravel road, I was someone who could be handed a number and shown a pen and expected to be grateful. He was wrong. And the thing is, if he had ever once treated me like a person worth talking to, he would have known that. He never asked. He never looked. He saw what he expected to see, and he built his entire plan on top of that assumption. That is a very expensive mistake to make when the man you are underestimating has owned your company for 22 years. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're sitting on something worth protecting, do not wait for someone to come after it before you decide to stand up for what is yours. Like and subscribe to Daddy's Revenge, and come back for more stories about people who built something real, stayed quiet about it, and showed up exactly when it mattered.